September 18th, 2015, Washington, D.C. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency publishes a notice of violation against Volkswagen AG. It is 11 paragraphs long. It is written in the dry, precise language of federal regulatory enforcement. It contains no exclamation marks, no dramatic language, no indication that the people who wrote it understood what they were detonating. Within 6 hours, Volkswagen's stock price dropped 20%. Within 3 days, it dropped 40%. Within 1 week, $30 billion in market value, $30 billion, has been erased from one of the most valuable companies in Europe. Here's what the EPA notice actually said, translated out of regulatory language into plain English. Volkswagen had been cheating for 7 years, across 11 million cars sold in 40 countries. They had installed hidden software, a piece of code so precisely engineered it could have only been written with a single deliberate purpose, that detected when a car was being tested for emissions and temporarily reduced the engine's power output to make the pollution numbers look acceptable. When the test was over and the car was back on the road, the software switched off. The engine went back to full power, and the nitrogen oxide pollution, the stuff that causes smog, triggers asthma attacks, and has been linked to heart disease and premature death, poured out at levels up to 40 times the legal limit. 40 times. Not a small rounding error, not a marginal exceedance that engineers had missed. 40 times the legal limit for 7 years across 11 million cars. And the part that should keep you up at night, this wasn't caught by regulators. The EPA didn't find it. The German government didn't find it. The European testing authorities, who had been testing these cars for years, didn't find it. A tiny research team at a university in West Virginia, funded by a $50,000 grant from a clean transport nonprofit, found it. 3 researchers, $50,000, a rented emissions testing van, a road trip from San Diego to Seattle. They brought down the largest car company in the world. Volkswagen didn't start as a scandal. It started as a promise. Literally Hitler's promise to give every German family a car. It survived a war, a partition, and 40 years of Cold War politics to become one of the most valuable industrial brands on Earth. And then, its engineers wrote 11 lines of software that destroyed $30 billion, sent executives to prison, and rewrote the rules of corporate accountability across 2 continents. This is that story. All of it. Berlin Motor Show. February 1933. Adolf Hitler has been Chancellor of Germany for 3 weeks. He stands at the podium and makes a promise that is less a business plan than a political vision. Germany will be motorized. Every German family will have a car. The automobile, which in 1933 was still primarily a luxury object, owned by the wealthy, will become what the bicycle is in Germany. Ordinary, accessible, universal. It was not an original idea. Henry Ford had done it in America. Stalin was doing something similar in the Soviet Union. The political logic of mass motorization was understood across the ideological spectrum. A population that drives is a population that is mobile, productive, and bound to the infrastructure that the state provides. Roads, fuel, traffic laws. The automobile made people dependent on systems the state controlled. Hitler wanted it for Germany specifically and immediately. The man he assigned to make it happen was Ferdinand Porsche, not yet the Porsche of the luxury sports car, but an engineer of genuine brilliance who had been designing vehicles for decades and who had, before the Nazi Commission, already been working on concepts for a small, affordable car. Porsche was not a Nazi ideologue. He was an engineer who wanted to build vehicles and found, in the Nazi government, a client with essentially unlimited resources and a political mandate that would override the normal commercial objections to an unproven mass-market vehicle. The design brief was specific and demanding. The car had to carry 2 adults and 3 children. It had to cruise at 100 kilometers per hour on the new Autobahn. It had to get 7 liters per 100 kilometers. Reasonable fuel economy for the era. And it had to cost no more than 990 Reichsmarks, roughly the price of a small motorcycle. At that price, it could theoretically be purchased by a German worker earning an average wage. Porsche's solution was the car that became the Beetle, the KDF wagon named for Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, the Nazi leisure organization that administered the savings scheme through which workers could purchase it. The design was distinctive. Rear-mounted air-cooled engine, rounded body that looked unlike anything else on German roads, simple mechanical systems that could be maintained without specialist equipment. The factory to build it was planned for a site near the Mittelland Canal in Lower Saxony. The city that grew around it was named KDF-Stadt, Strength through Joy City. It would later be renamed Wolfsburg, the name it still carries today. Volkswagen's global headquarters remains there. Construction of the factory began in 1938, using forced labor from concentration camps and occupied territories. The workers who built the building that would build the people's car were not the German workers who were supposed to buy it. They were prisoners. The moral architecture of the whole enterprise was contaminated from the first shovelful of earth. The savings scheme sold, by 1939, approximately 340,000 contracts. Workers paid in every month toward a car they expected to receive when they had accumulated enough. The war began in September 1939. Car production for civilians essentially stopped. The factory switched to military vehicles, the Kubelwagen, the VW Type 82 utility vehicles for the Wehrmacht. The 336,000 people who had been paying into the saving scheme received nothing. After the war, the German Democratic Republic tried to pursue compensation claims. The courts were largely unsympathetic. Most of the savers never received anything meaningful from the company whose factory their savings had helped capitalize. The factory survived the war in better condition than most German industrial sites. The Allies needed it. By April 1945, British forces occupied Wolfsburg and took control of the plant. British Army Major Ivan Hurst was assigned to assess it. Hurst made a decision that changed European industrial history. Instead of dismantling the factory and shipping the equipment to Britain as war reparations, which was the standard procedure for captured industrial assets, he restarted production. The reason was practical. Germany needed vehicles. The British Occupation Administration needed transport. The factory was there. The tooling was there. And the Beetle design was genuinely viable. Hurst ordered production to restart in December 1945. The first post-war Volkswagen rolled off the line. What Hurst had done, essentially, was save Volkswagen. British automotive manufacturers were offered the company and the design as a gift, free of charge. Take it, here is a ready-made car factory producing a ready-made car. They declined. The Beetle was ugly, they said. Rear-engined, air-cooled, it would never sell. The British car industry's refusal to take Volkswagen is one of the more consequential business decisions of the post-war era. They said no, and walked away from a company that would go on to sell over 21 million Beetles and become one of the most valuable automotive groups on earth. In 1948, the British handed control of Volkswagen to the newly formed West German state government of Lower Saxony. Heinrich Nordhoff, a former Opel executive, was appointed general director. Nordhoff inherited a factory, a design, and a workforce. What he lacked was a market, a distribution network, and a plan for turning a car designed for Hitler's Germany into a viable product for a different world. He built all three. But first he had to reckon with what the car actually was. Not technically. Technically it was a good, simple, reliable vehicle that performed well in testing. But historically, politically, symbolically, it was the Kadef-Wagen. It bore the genetic imprint of a regime that had just killed tens of millions of people. Nordhoff made a decision that was both pragmatic and, in retrospect, morally convenient. He separated the product from its history. The car was the car. The engineering was the engineering. The factory was the factory. The previous ownership was over. This was a new company building for a new Germany, selling to a new world. It worked, partly because the car was genuinely good, partly because Germany needed the economic activity, and partly because the rest of the world was willing in the late 1940s to let Germany be new. By 1955, Volkswagen had produced its 1 millionth Beetle. That's not an obvious trajectory from a factory that was making military vehicles for the Wehrmacht a decade earlier. 1 million cars in 10 years from a bombed-out plant in a city that hadn't existed before the war. Nordhoff had done something remarkable, not just operationally, but commercially. He had taken a car designed by the Nazi state for ideological purposes and turned it into a product that sold in the United States, in Brazil, in Australia, in markets that had fought against the country that built it. The American market was the critical one. The Beetle's American success story is one of the more interesting chapters in post-war consumer culture. And it worked for reasons that nobody in Wolfsburg had quite anticipated. In 1950s America, cars were enormous, chrome-laden, annually restyled symbols of prosperity and confidence. Planned obsolescence was a deliberate industry strategy. General Motors' Alfred Sloan had figured out decades earlier that if you changed the styling every year, people would want the new one even if the old one worked perfectly. American cars got longer, lower, wider, more finned, more ornamental, more everything. The Beetle was the precise opposite. It was small, it was round. It didn't change year to year in any visible way. Volkswagen's position was that the car improved mechanically, but you wouldn't know it by looking at it. The engine was in the back. There was no water in the cooling system. It got 30 miles per gallon at a time when American cars got 12. It found a market that the American automotive industry had not anticipated and did not know how to serve. Buyers who didn't want what Detroit was selling, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they found it excessive. The Beetle became the car of the counterculture before there was a counterculture. It was practical, unpretentious, and looked like nothing else on an American road. The advertising that Doyle Dane Bernbach created for Volkswagen in the late 1950s and 1960s is still studied in advertising courses as some of the best ever made. Think small, lemon. Ads that made self-deprecating jokes about the car's limitations in a media environment where every other automotive advertisement was claiming supremacy. The campaign worked because it was honest, and honesty in advertising was so unusual in 1960 that it read as sophisticated. By 1968, Volkswagen was selling over 500,000 cars annually in the United States alone. The Beetle had become a cultural icon. It appeared in films, in songs, in political imagery. It was the car that represented something about simplicity and authenticity that resonated with a generation questioning the values of their parents. The irony, and it is a very large irony, is that the car that became the symbol of the anti-establishment was originally designed by the establishment of all establishments, but the Beetle's success also contained the seeds of Volkswagen's first existential crisis. The car that had defined the company for 30 years was aging. The market was changing. Younger buyers in the 1970s wanted something more modern. Japanese manufacturers were producing reliable, fuel-efficient small cars that competed directly with the Beetle on its core proposition. VW's response was the Golf. Introduced in 1974, the Golf was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, a different aesthetic language entirely from the Beetle's organic curves. It was a practical hatchback, front-wheel drive, water-cooled engine, fold-down rear seats, the layout that would become standard for compact cars globally. It was modern without being flashy. It was well-engineered without being exotic. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, exactly what the European and American markets needed from a small car in the mid-1970s. The Golf GTI variant, launched in 1976, added a turbocharged engine and sport suspension to create the hot hatch category that basically didn't exist before it. You could buy a practical, efficient, affordable small car that also, if you wanted to, drove like something considerably more expensive. The GTI became a cultural object in its own right, particularly in Europe, where it defined what a driver's car for ordinary people should feel like. The Golf sold 30 million units over its production run. 30 million. It is one of the best-selling cars in history, and it saved Volkswagen from the obsolescence that had overtaken other single-product automotive brands. By the 1980s, Volkswagen was a genuine global automaker, manufacturing in Germany, Belgium, Mexico, South Africa, and Brazil. The Brazilian operation had been started in the 1950s and had grown into one of VW's most significant markets. The Golf and its platform derivatives gave the company a product architecture that could be adapted for different markets without requiring completely separate development programs. What VW still lacked relative to its aspirations was a genuine luxury presence. The Beetle was a people's car. The Golf was a practical car. Neither of them said wealth, sophistication, or engineering excellence in the way that BMW or Mercedes said those things. The acquisition strategy that would address this was already beginning to take shape in the 1980s, under a CEO named Karl Hahn. But the man who would really execute it, and in doing so build the empire that the emissions scandal would eventually threaten, was Ferdinand Piëch, and Ferdinand Piëch is the figure without whom the Dieselgate story cannot be understood. Ferdinand Piëch is one of the most consequential and most feared figures in the history of the automotive industry. He was, by birth, connected to both Volkswagen and Porsche simultaneously. His grandfather was Ferdinand Porsche, who designed the original Beetle, and his mother Louise was the sister of Ferry Porsche, who built Porsche into a sports car manufacturer after the war. In the tangled family history of German automotive engineering, Piëch was at the center of the web. He joined Volkswagen's management in 1993 as CEO and immediately began reshaping the company with a directness that was, by German corporate standards, almost violent. His management style is documented extensively in the business literature and in the accounts of people who worked for him, and it was consistently characterized the same way. Brilliance combined with a capacity for intimidation that made most executives afraid to bring him problems. Piëch had an engineering mind of genuine quality. He had overseen the development of the Le Mans-winning Porsche 917 earlier in his career and understood performance engineering at a technical level that most automotive CEOs could not match. He used that technical knowledge as a weapon in management meetings. If you brought him an explanation he found inadequate, he would expose its inadequacy in front of everyone in the room. The culture this created at VW is central to understanding Dieselgate. When the CEO responds to problems by identifying who failed and removing them, the organizational incentive is to not bring problems to the CEO, to solve them quietly, to find a way to make the numbers look right without surfacing the underlying issue. This cultural dynamic, we cannot tell leadership that we cannot meet the target, so we will find another way to meet the target, is the direct ancestor of the defeat device. But before the fraud, there was the empire. Piëch's acquisition strategy was systematic and expensive. He acquired Seat, the Spanish automaker, and Škoda, the Czech manufacturer, and integrated both into the VW Group architecture using a platform-sharing approach that allowed common components across multiple brands while maintaining distinct styling and positioning. He acquired Bentley, the British luxury manufacturer, in a bidding war with BMW. He acquired Lamborghini. He brought Bugatti back from effective dormancy and commissioned the Veyron, a car with a 16-cylinder engine producing 1,000 horsepower that existed primarily to prove that VW Group engineering could do anything it wanted to. He also oversaw Audi's transformation. The Audi that existed before Piëch's influence was a competent but unremarkable mid-range manufacturer. The Audi that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s was a genuine luxury competitor with design language, technology, and positioning that allowed it to charge prices comparable to BMW and Mercedes. The success of this repositioning was one of the most significant brand turnarounds in automotive history. The platform strategy that Piëch deployed across the VW Group is worth understanding because it was genuinely revolutionary in its scale and ambition. Rather than each brand developing its own fundamental architecture, chassis, suspension geometry, basic body structure, VW Group would develop a small number of platforms that could be used across multiple brands. A Volkswagen Golf and an Audi A3 and a Seat Leon and a Škoda Octavia would all share the same basic underpinnings, while having completely different bodies, interiors, and brand identities. The economies of scale this generated were significant. Development costs for a new platform could be spread across millions of vehicles across multiple brands. Manufacturing efficiency improved because the same tooling and processes could be used for multiple models. Supplier relationships were consolidated and negotiating leverage increased. By the time Piëch stepped back from the CEO role in 2002, handing off to Bernd Pissitzrieder and then Martin Winterkorn, VW Group had 12 brands and was selling approximately 6 million vehicles annually. The group's revenue had roughly doubled over his tenure. The company's ambition to become the world's largest automaker was now a credible strategic goal rather than a management fantasy. The relationship between Piëch and Winterkorn, who had worked under Piëch as head of Audi, was one of the defining dynamics of the pre-scandal period. Piëch remained as chairman of the supervisory board even after leaving the CEO role. Winterkorn ran day-to-day operations. The understanding between them was that Winterkorn would execute Strategy 2018, the plan to become the world's largest automaker, with the same relentlessness that Piëch had applied to the acquisition strategy. The pressure to perform was embedded in the structure of their relationship. Winterkorn had been chosen by Piëch. He operated under Piëch's oversight, His continuance depended on delivering the results that Piech's ambitions required. This is the management context in which clean diesel became VW's American strategy, and in which the engineers building the diesel engines found themselves caught between physics and an executive culture that treated missed targets as personal failures. America was always the hard market for Volkswagen, not commercially. VW sold cars in America reasonably well. But strategically, the American market had specific characteristics that the European market didn't, and those characteristics created genuine engineering challenges that VW's ambitions kept colliding with. The biggest one was emissions. American emission standards, particularly for nitrogen oxide, NOx, were significantly stricter than European standards. This mattered enormously for diesel engines, because diesel combustion is efficient and produces less carbon dioxide than gasoline combustion. But it produces substantially more NOx. The chemistry of the diesel cycle trades one kind of pollution for another. In Europe, this trade-off had been largely accepted. European standards were written in ways that allowed diesel's CO2 advantage to offset its NOx disadvantage. Diesel cars accounted for roughly 50% of European passenger car sales by the 2000s, partly because of the efficiency advantage, partly because European fuel taxes made the per-kilometer cost of diesel operation significantly lower than gasoline. In America, the diesel car had never successfully established itself. American drivers were suspicious of diesel. They associated it with the underpowered, smoky, unreliable diesel passenger cars that GM had sold briefly in the late 1970s, and that had been a genuine disaster. American emission standards also made clean diesel harder to achieve. The NOx limits were tight enough that meeting them required either expensive exhaust treatment systems or engine tuning that sacrificed the efficiency advantages that made diesel worth doing in the first place. VW wanted American diesel market share. The clean diesel narrative, fuel-efficient, lower CO2, modern technology that had moved beyond the old diesel stereotypes, was the marketing proposition. The Golf TDI and Jetta TDI were positioned as the environmentally responsible choice for the American buyer who wanted good fuel economy without sacrificing performance. The advertising leaned into this hard. VW ran television commercials showing diesel Jettas racing gasoline competitors at track events while emitting dramatically less CO2. They ran print ads comparing their TDI engines favorably to hybrids. They used the phrase clean diesel repeatedly and prominently. Clean doing a lot of heavy lifting as an adjective in a context where diesel engines were not, in any straightforward sense of the word, clean. The TDI lineup sold well. American buyers responded positively to the combination of genuine fuel economy numbers, VW's design and quality reputation, and the clean diesel marketing positioning. Between 2008 and 2015, VW sold approximately 580,000 diesel vehicles in the United States under the TDI banner. But here's the engineering reality that nobody in the advertisements mentioned. Meeting American NOx standards with a diesel engine while maintaining the performance characteristics that made the cars attractive to buyers was at the technology level VW was using essentially impossible without one of two solutions. Solution one was selective catalytic reduction, a system that injects a urea-based fluid called AdBlue into the exhaust stream, which reacts with NOx to produce nitrogen and water. This worked. It worked well. BMW was using it. Mercedes was using it. It added a small tank of AdBlue that needed periodic refilling, and it added cost to the vehicle, but it met the standards cleanly. VW had decided not to use this system for most of its TDI lineup. The decision appears to have been partly cost-driven and partly an engineering philosophy that preferred simpler systems. Piech's culture valued elegant solutions. Adding a fluid reservoir and a dosing system felt inelegant. Solution 2 was lean NOx traps, a different exhaust treatment approach that stored NOx and periodically flushed it during specific driving conditions. This also worked, but it had limitations. It was less effective under the wide range of real-world driving conditions that American regulations required, and it created a tension between NOx performance and the fuel economy numbers that the marketing was built around. The engineers at VW's engine development division in Wolfsburg were caught between these two realities: the NOx targets required by American regulations and the performance and efficiency targets required by the marketing strategy and executive expectations. They reported the problem. The problem was received in a management culture shaped by PX standards as a failure of engineering rather than a legitimate technical constraint. The expectation was that engineers found solutions to problems. Reporting that a solution didn't exist was not acceptable. This is where the story turns dark. Somewhere in the engine development division, and the precise chain of decisions remains contested in litigation and internal investigations, someone proposed a different kind of solution, not an engineering solution to the NRS problem, a software solution to the measurement problem. If you could detect when the car was being emissions tested, you could run the engine in a special mode during the test. Lower performance, higher exhaust treatment, NOx within limits. When the test was over, you switched back to the normal operating mode. The customer got the performance they paid for. The regulator got the numbers they required. The problem, as experienced by VW, was solved. The engineers who wrote this code understood exactly what they were building. This is not a case where someone accidentally created a test detection system while solving a different problem. The defeat device, that is what it is legally and technically called, required specific engineering effort to accomplish a specific fraudulent purpose. Someone decided to build it. Multiple people knew about it. Management approved the engines that contained it. And for 7 years, nobody stopped it. To understand what the defeat device actually was, how it worked technically, how it evaded detection for 7 years, and what the detection ultimately required, you need to understand how emissions testing worked in 2008. The regulatory framework for vehicle emissions in the United States required manufacturers to certify that their vehicles met specific limits for pollutants, including carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen oxide. The certification process involved testing vehicles on a dynamometer, a rolling road in a laboratory environment where the car's wheels turn against resistance rollers while the engine runs and exhaust gases are measured. The test cycle was standardized. The federal test procedure specified exactly how the test would proceed, a specific sequence of accelerations, decelerations, and steady speeds over a specific time period, following a specific profile. Every vehicle going through certification ran the same test. The profile was publicly documented. Anyone could read exactly what the sequence looked like. This is the fundamental vulnerability that the defeat device exploited. The software installed in VW's TDI engines could detect, with high reliability, that the car was being tested on the federal test procedure. The detection worked by monitoring multiple vehicle parameters simultaneously. The steering wheel angle was near zero because a car on a dynamometer doesn't turn. The vehicle speed followed the specific FTP profile. The engine had been running for a specific duration. The ambient temperature and barometric pressure were within typical lab ranges, and several other parameters. No combination of these conditions occurred in normal driving. Together, they were essentially unique to the FTP test environment. When the software detected all conditions simultaneously, it flagged an emissions test mode. In emissions test mode, the engine management system adjusted the exhaust treatment parameters to maximize NOx reduction, running the lean NOx trap more aggressively, limiting performance, prioritizing clean exhaust over efficiency and power. The engine passed the test. Emissions within legal limits, certificate granted. When the test was over and the car was driven normally, conditions that didn't match the FTP detection criteria, the software switched back to normal operating mode. In normal operating mode, the lean NOx trap ran on an optimized cycle that prioritized fuel efficiency and performance over NOx reduction. Nitrogen oxide emissions in this mode were between 10 and 40 times the legal limit, depending on driving conditions and the specific engine variant. The car on the road was a fundamentally different machine from the car that had been tested. The gap between what VW knew and what regulators knew was total. American regulators tested cars in laboratories. They had no routine procedure for testing vehicles in real-world driving conditions. The FTP cycle was the standard. If your car passed the FTP cycle, your car was certified. The idea that a manufacturer would deliberately engineer software to pass the FTP cycle while behaving differently in real operation was, if anyone at the EPA had thought of it before 2014, apparently not considered a realistic possibility. The people who thought of it were not at the EPA. They were at the International Council on Clean Transportation, a small non-profit focused on clean transportation policy, and at West Virginia University's Center for Alternative Fuels, Engines and Emissions. In 2012, ICCT was examining why European diesel vehicles, which had been certified to meet European NOx standards, appeared to emit substantially more NOx in real-world conditions than in certification tests. They wanted to understand the gap between certified performance and actual performance. They commissioned West Virginia University to conduct real-world testing on a selection of diesel vehicles, measuring NOx emissions in actual driving rather than laboratory conditions. The WBU team, primarily 3 researchers, Professors Dan Carder and Arvind Thiruvengadam, and their student Mark Besch, developed a portable emissions measurement system that could be mounted in a vehicle and measure exhaust gases in real time during normal driving. They had $50,000 from ICCT to run the project. In May 2013, they drove a rented 2012 Volkswagen Jetta TDI from San Diego to Seattle. They drove a Volkswagen Passat TDI. The BMW's real-world NOx emissions were close to its certified levels. High, but within a reasonable range of the lab results. The Jetta's NOx emissions were 15 to 35 times the certified level, depending on driving conditions. The Passats were 5 to 20 times the certified level. The researchers published their findings in May 2014 in a report for ICCT. The results were striking enough that ICCT shared them with the California Air Resources Board and the EPA. The EPA began correspondence with Volkswagen, requesting an explanation for the discrepancy. VW's initial responses were a masterclass in corporate delay tactics. They acknowledged the discrepancy. They proposed technical explanations, auxiliary emission control devices, temperature-sensitive systems, factors that affected performance in specific conditions. They conducted additional testing. They issued a voluntary software recall in December 2014, claiming to have addressed the issue. The post-recall testing by CARB showed that the emissions were still elevated. The explanation wasn't holding. The software update had not fixed anything. By September 2015, CARB and the EPA had concluded that the explanation VW was offering was not consistent with the data they were seeing. CARB informed VW that it would not certify the 2016 model year TDI vehicles unless VW provided a satisfactory explanation. VW's lawyers arranged a meeting with regulators on September 3, 2015. In that meeting, according to accounts from people present, Volkswagen representatives acknowledged for the first time the existence of the defeat device. The EPA began drafting the notice of violation. On September 18, 2015, they published it. Friday, September 18, 2015, the EPA publishes the notice of violation at approximately 9 a.m. Eastern Time. The document is addressed to Volkswagen Group of America, Audi of America, and Volkswagen AG. It alleges violations of the Clean Air Act. It describes the defeat device. It covers approximately 482,000 vehicles in the United States, TDI diesel vehicles from the 2009 through 2015 model years. Within an hour, the story is on every major wire service: Associated Press, Reuters, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the New York Times. At VW's North American headquarters in Herndon, Virginia, phones are ringing simultaneously. At the Wolfsburg headquarters in Germany, it is already late afternoon, and executives who are beginning to process what is happening are facing the immediate question that every corporate communications department faces in a crisis. What do we say? The initial public statement from Volkswagen was in the context of what was being alleged, almost breathtaking in its inadequacy. The company expressed its commitment to cooperating with the EPA. It said it was conducting an internal investigation. It did not deny the device. It did not admit it clearly either. It occupied the specific corporate language territory that is designed to say nothing while appearing to respond. VW's stock opened on Friday at approximately €160. By the close of European markets, it was at 132. Monday morning, it opened at 106. By Tuesday close, it was approaching 92. In 3 trading days, roughly €26 billion in market capitalization, approximately $30 billion, had ceased to exist. The person who had to face the cameras was Martin Winterkorn. Winterkorn had been CEO of Volkswagen since 2007. He had built his tenure around precision, quality, and the relentless pursuit of the 2018 market leadership goal. He was not a man known for public warmth or communicative ease. His management style was technical and exacting. and it translated poorly to a moment that required something different entirely. On Sunday, September 20th, 2 days after the EPA notice, he apologized. He said VW had broken the trust of customers and the public. He said he was ordering an external investigation. He used the phrase, "deeply sorry," in a tone that several communications analysts described in real time as reading from a script he had not written and did not fully inhabit. On Wednesday, September 23rd, 5 days after the EPA notice, Winterkorn resigned. His resignation statement contained a sentence that would be quoted extensively in the coverage that followed. He said he was not aware of any wrongdoing on his part. He was resigning, he implied, because the company needed new leadership for a new chapter, not because he had done anything wrong. The German prosecutor's office would later disagree. Winterkorn was charged with fraud, false advertising, and market manipulation. In 2019, a formal criminal indictment was filed. He contested jurisdiction, claiming health grounds to avoid extradition proceedings. As of 2025, he remains uncharged in any concluded criminal proceeding, but faces ongoing legal exposure. The scope of the scandal expanded rapidly in the days after the initial notice. The 482,000 vehicles in the initial notice covered only the US spec 2.0-liter TDI engines. Within days, it emerged that a 3.0-liter V6 diesel engine used in Audi and Porsche vehicles also contained defeat device software in a different form. The US vehicle count rose towards 600,000. Then the international scope became clear. 11 million vehicles globally. Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Spain, China, Australia. Anywhere VW had sold TDI diesel vehicles, the defeat device was in all of them. The European regulatory response was initially slower than the American one. European emissions testing was, at the time, even more laboratory dependent than American testing, and the political relationship between European governments and the domestic automotive industries made aggressive enforcement complicated. But the headlines were global. VW cheat. Dieselgate. Volkswagen lied. Every major newspaper in the world was running the story. Every VW dealer in 20 countries was fielding calls from customers who wanted to know if their car was one of them. Customer service lines were overwhelmed. Showroom traffic dropped. The German government, which holds a stake in Volkswagen through the state of Lower Saxony, which owns approximately 20% of VW's voting shares, was in the position of being both a shareholder in and the regulator of a company that had just committed regulatory fraud on an international scale. The conflict of interest was visible from a significant distance. Chancellor Angela Merkel called for full transparency and complete cooperation with investigators. The German Transport Ministry launched its own investigation. The European Parliament called hearings. The new CEO, Matthias Müller, brought in from Porsche, which was ironic given Porsche's own complicated relationship with VW governance, gave his first press conference wearing an expression that suggested he had been handed a situation he would not have chosen to inherit under any circumstances. He said VW would fix every affected vehicle. He said the company would cooperate with all regulatory authorities. He said the company was committed to restoring trust. What he could not yet say, because nobody knew yet, was what fixing 11 million vehicles would actually cost, how many executives would be prosecuted, how many class action lawsuits would be filed, or whether Volkswagen would survive as the company it had been. The answers, as they emerged over the following months and years, were a very great deal, several, many thousands, and technically, yes, but fundamentally differently. The financial accounting of Dieselgate is one of the largest single tallies of corporate fraud costs in history. Let's go through it systematically, because the numbers are large enough that they lose meaning if presented all at once. The direct U.S. settlement, the agreement VW reached with the EPA, the FTC, and the states, was structured across 2 tranches. For owners of the 2.0-liter TDI vehicles, VW offered either a buyback at pre-scandal market value or a free repair plus cash compensation. Most U.S. owners chose the buyback. VW spent approximately $10 billion buying back roughly 350,000 vehicles from American customers. This was, from a logistics standpoint, an extraordinary operation. VW set up storage lots across the United States. Vehicles were driven in, parked, and left. Fields of unwanted TDIs, sitting in rows across former airstrips and raceways in California, Illinois, and Texas. Tens of thousands of cars that had been correctly manufactured, correctly sold, correctly operated by customers who had done nothing wrong, sitting in storage because the company that built them had lied about them. The second tranche of the U.S. settlement covered environmental remediation, compensation for the excess NOx that the cars had emitted over years of real-world operation. This fund, approximately $2.7 billion, was directed to states for use in environmental and clean transportation projects. California alone received hundreds of millions of dollars. The U.S. criminal fine was $4.3 billion, the largest criminal fine in U.S. automotive history at the time. The guilty plea from Volkswagen AG admitted to conspiring to defraud the United States, wire fraud, and violation of the Clean Air Act. It was a corporate guilty plea, meaning the legal entity, the company, admitted criminal conduct. This was unusual. Companies typically settle without admitting wrongdoing. Individual criminal charges in the United States were filed against 7 VW executives. Oliver Schmidt, who had been VW's regulatory compliance manager in the United States and had participated in meetings with regulators where the defeat device was not disclosed, was arrested at Miami Airport in 2017 while attempting to return to Germany. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy in violation of the Clean Air Act. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, the longest sentence given to any individual in the Dieselgate case. James Liang, a VW engineer who had been involved in the development of the defeat device, also pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors. He received a sentence of 40 months. Several other VW executives who had returned to Germany were indicted but could not be extradited under German law, which generally does not extradite its own citizens. Beyond the United States, the financial consequences rolled out across multiple jurisdictions. The European settlements were slower and substantially smaller, reflecting the difference in regulatory culture and legal systems between the US and Europe. Germany fined VW approximately €1 billion in 2018. Other European countries pursued their own actions with varying degrees of success. The class action litigation from European consumers was more legally complex than the American version. European consumer protection law did not provide the same class action mechanisms as American law, and VW's legal strategy in Europe was to settle individual cases rather than acknowledge a collective liability. This approach kept European individual settlements substantially lower than American ones. Australia, South Korea, and several other jurisdictions also pursued enforcement actions with fines ranging from tens to hundreds of millions of their respective currencies. The total direct financial cost, fines, settlements, buybacks, remediation funds, legal fees, exceeded $33 billion by most comprehensive tallies. Some analyses put the total higher when including indirect costs, the recall and repair program for vehicles that were kept rather than bought back, the supply chain disruptions, the engineering costs of developing compliant replacement systems. The reputational cost is harder to quantify, but was real and measurable in several specific ways. VW's US market share dropped from approximately 2.5% in 2015 to approximately 1.5% by 2018. Diesel vehicles became essentially unsellable in the United States. VW discontinued diesel offerings in the American market entirely after the scandal. The clean diesel marketing proposition that had taken years and tens of millions of advertising dollars to establish was destroyed overnight and has not been rebuilt. The brand damage extended beyond diesel. Consumer trust surveys in the years following the scandal showed VW Group brands scoring lower on quality and reliability perception than they had pre-scandal, not just for diesel models, but across the lineup. The association of the VW name with deliberate deception contaminated attitudes toward the brand more broadly. The financial damage to individual executives, beyond the criminal sentences, included the recovery of compensation paid to executives during the period of fraud. The VW Supervisory Board pursued civil recovery claims against Minterkorn and other executives. German courts became venues for ongoing disputes about who bore financial responsibility for decisions that had cost the company more than $30 billion. And through all of it, the company had to keep operating. Cars had to be designed, manufactured, marketed, and sold. Dealers had to be supported. Suppliers had to be paid. Employees, 600,000 of them, had to be retained and managed through a crisis that made the company they worked for an object of international ridicule. That VW survived all of this as a functioning company is, depending on your perspective. either a testament to the resilience of large industrial enterprises or evidence of how difficult it is to fundamentally damage a company that is deeply embedded in the supply chain and employment fabric of a major economy. Probably both. The question that German prosecutors, American federal investigators, and several hundred journalists spent years trying to answer was, who knew about the defeat device and when did they know it? The answer, as it has emerged through litigation, guilty pleas, and document discovery, is complicated in ways that reveal something important about how large organizations commit fraud. It is almost certainly not the case that the defeat device was a secret known only to a small group of rogue engineers who concealed it from their superiors. 11 million cars across multiple model years, using technology that required ongoing engineering support and integration with new engine variants. That level of operational persistence requires institutional knowledge, not individual concealment. It is also probably not the case that it was explicitly approved at the highest levels in a documented board meeting with a vote and a signed authorization. Companies that commit fraud do not typically generate paper trails describing their intent to commit fraud. What the evidence suggests is something in between, a systemic institutional knowledge that was simultaneously pervasive and compartmentalized, where many people at many levels knew aspects of the situation without fully confronting what the complete picture meant. The engineering teams who developed the defeat device software knew exactly what they were building. This is established. The code was too precisely engineered for its purpose to have been accidental, and the guilty pleas from VW engineers include explicit acknowledgments of knowing the software's function. The managers of those engineering teams were aware of the software. Engineering decisions at this level of significance, software that affected engine certification, that required specific integration with the engine management system, that had to be maintained across model year updates, did not happen without management awareness. Where the documentation becomes thinner is at the level above, the senior executives who received certification reports showing that the TDI engines met American emissions standards. Those executives knew the engines were certified. They may or may not have known precisely how the certification had been achieved. The question of what they should have known, given the information available to them, is at the heart of the ongoing German criminal proceedings against Winterkorn and other senior executives. Several specific moments in the timeline are particularly significant. In 2011, a VW engineer sent an internal presentation that described the defeat device's function in relatively explicit terms, referring to a switchover strategy that changed engine behavior depending on operating conditions. This presentation was circulated within the engineering division. The question of how far up the management chain it traveled has been central to the German investigations. In 2014, when the ICT/WVU study results became known internally and VW began responding to EPA inquiries, decisions were made at a management level about how to respond. The decision to issue a voluntary recall in December 2014, a recall that did not actually fix the problem, was a management decision, not an engineering one. Someone approved the position that a software update addressed the issue when the internal data showed it did not. In early 2015, as EPA scrutiny intensified, meetings occurred at senior management levels about how to handle the regulatory situation. The content of those meetings is disputed in ongoing litigation, with different participants offering different accounts of what was said and who knew what. Winterkorn has consistently maintained that he was not informed of the defeat device until shortly before the EPA notice was published, specifically that a memo flagging the issue was included in a document package he received in late September 2015 that he did not personally read before the story broke. German prosecutors alleged that earlier knowledge is evidenced by documents showing the issue was escalated to his level in 2014. The picture of Oliver Schmidt, the compliance manager, who sat in meetings with American regulators in 2014 and 2015, while the company's position was that there was no defeat device, is perhaps the clearest human illustration of how the institutional knowledge worked. Schmidt was not an engineer. He was a regulatory affairs manager. His job was to manage VW's relationship with American regulators. In that role, he participated in discussions where the defeat device was directly relevant, and he did not disclose it. He was convicted in an American federal court of knowingly making false statements to regulators. The sentence was 7 years. The broader lesson of the who knew question is not primarily about individual culpability, though individual culpability is real and several individuals are in prison for it. The broader lesson is about what organizational cultures produce. A culture in which engineers cannot tell senior management that a technical target cannot be met without losing their positions, a culture that PX management philosophy had substantially created, is a culture that generates defeat devices, not because anyone decided to commit fraud as the preferred option, but because the alternative to fraud, reporting that the clean diesel target was unachievable without costly urea-based systems, was experienced as personally and professionally dangerous. The defeat device was not the first choice. It was what happened when the first choice was unavailable. In November 2015, 6 weeks after the EPA notice, while the lawsuits were filing and the prosecutors were opening investigations, and the stock price was still half what it had been, Volkswagen announced the most significant strategic pivot in its history. The company was going electric, not eventually, not as a hedge. As the primary strategic direction, VW committed to spending 80 billion euros on electric vehicle development and production over the following 5 years. They announced the ID platform, a purpose-built electric vehicle architecture that would underpin a range of new models. They set targets for electric vehicle sales that, if achieved, would make VW one of the largest EV producers in the world. The timing was not subtle. The company that had been caught cheating on emissions tests was announcing that it was abandoning the technology it had cheated on in favor of technology that produced no tailpipe emissions at all. The PR logic was transparent. The strategic logic was also real, which made the announcement more than just a communications maneuver. VW had watched Tesla from a distance since its founding, with a mixture of dismissiveness and anxiety that established manufacturers typically apply to startups claiming to disrupt their industry. The 2015 crisis accelerated the internal discussion about whether Tesla's trajectory represented a genuine threat or an overpriced novelty. The conclusion Volkswagen's leadership reached in the immediate post-scandal period was that the electric transition was coming regardless of VW's preference, that the regulatory environment globally was moving toward electric mandates, and that a company of VW's scale either led the transition or was defined by it. The ID. 3. VW's first purpose-built electric vehicle on the new platform, launched in Europe in 2020. It was designed to occupy the same market position as the Golf, practical, affordable, well-engineered, not exotic or aspirational. Ordinary, a car for ordinary people who happen to need a car that produced no tailpipe emissions. The execution was rocky. The ID.3's initial software was substantially unfinished at launch. The vehicle was shipped to customers with features disabled and bugs unresolved, requiring over-the-air software updates that addressed problems that should not have existed in a production vehicle. The software quality crisis was extensively reported and compared, unfavorably, to Tesla's approach to software development. It was also compared, more quietly but perhaps more damagingly, to the defeat device. Twice in 5 years, Volkswagen's software had been a headline. The contexts were completely different. One was fraud, one was quality failure. But the association reinforced a narrative about VW's relationship with digital technology that the company was working hard to escape. The ID. 4. The electric SUV that followed the ID. 3. Sold better. It was better executed. By 22, WW Group was the second largest electric vehicle seller in Europe, behind Stellantis and ahead of every other traditional automaker. In China, VW's largest market globally, the electric transition was proceeding more quickly than in Europe, and VW's Chinese joint ventures were producing electric vehicles at volumes that were significant in absolute terms, if not competitive with the domestic Chinese EV manufacturers who were growing explosively. The Audi e-tron, the Porsche Taycan, the VW ID lineup. The group's electric portfolio expanded steadily. The Taycan in particular was commercially successful and critically well regarded. A genuine Porsche sports car that happened to be electric, which demonstrated that the brand could transition without losing the performance identity that justified its pricing. But the electric pivot also created new problems that the Dieselgate crisis had obscured. VW's manufacturing infrastructure, its vast German factories, its unionized workforce, its supplier relationships, was optimized for internal combustion engine production. Electric vehicles require fundamentally different manufacturing processes: battery pack assembly, electric motor manufacturing, different body structural requirements. The retooling required was enormous, expensive, and disruptive to a workforce whose skills were built around the technology being replaced. The labor relations dimension was significant. VW's German unions, IG Metall, and the Works Council that had co-determination representation on VW's supervisory board were directly engaged in the transition planning. The commitment to maintain German employment levels through the electric transition was both a political necessity and an operational constraint. You could not move rapidly to electric manufacturing efficiency without restructuring a workforce that had legal protections and political leverage. The China problem was more severe. VW's Chinese market, historically its most profitable globally, was being contested by domestic Chinese EV manufacturers at a speed and price point that VW struggled to match. BYD, Geely, and SAIC's domestic brands were offering electric vehicles at price points significantly below what VW could achieve with its cost structure, with features and software quality that Chinese consumers increasingly preferred. By 2204, VW's China market share was declining measurably. The company that had defined affordable mass-market transportation in China for decades was losing ground to Chinese competitors in the market that had become its most important financial contributor. The announcement in late 2204 that VW was considering closing German factories for the first time in its history, a previously unthinkable move, reflected the severity of the competitive pressure and the cost structure problem. The electric pivot was real. The execution remained incomplete. The competitive environment had become harder than the 2015 optimism had anticipated. And all of it, the investment requirements, the competitive pressure, the restructuring costs, was being funded partly by a company that had spent $30 billion on the consequences of 11 lines of software. The honest accounting of Volkswagen's legacy requires holding its genuine achievements and its specific fraud simultaneously, without letting either dissolve the other. Start with what is real and positive. Volkswagen built, in 80 years from a bombed factory in an occupied country, one of the most significant industrial enterprises in the world. The engineering culture that produced the Golf, the Audi TT, the Porsche 911 Evolution under its ownership, the Bugatti Veyron. Whatever you think of the fraud, the engineering capability was real. The platform-sharing approach that VW Group pioneered in the 1990s was genuinely innovative and has been copied by every major automotive manufacturer in the world. The employment, 600,000 people globally, hundreds of thousands in Germany specifically, is economically significant in ways that are hard to replace. The Beatles' cultural impact was real and, in its American chapter, connected to something genuinely positive in post-war consumer culture. The Golf's impact on the compact car category, defining what a well-engineered affordable car could feel like across 50 years, is a genuine industrial achievement. The Dieselgate response, whatever its motivations, produced one of the most significant regulatory investments in electric vehicle infrastructure in history. The $2.7 billion Environmental Remediation Fund in the United States, the Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust, financed charging infrastructure, electric bus fleets, and clean transportation initiatives across American states at a scale that would not otherwise have existed. The settlement's environmental component created a direct line from the fraud to a measurable positive environmental outcome. Now the other side. The defeat device was deliberate. This point resists softening. VW did not make a mistake in engine calibration that accidentally produced misleading emissions results. VW engineers designed software specifically intended to deceive regulatory testing while allowing real-world pollution at multiples of the legal limit. The harm was real. Epidemiologists have estimated that the excess NOx from 11 million defeat device vehicles contributed to premature deaths in the thousands globally, through respiratory and cardiovascular disease associated with NOx-related air pollution. The cover-up, the 2014 recall that didn't fix the problem, the meetings with regulators where the truth was withheld, the corporate response that prioritized legal positioning over public disclosure, extended the period of harm and demonstrated that the fraud was not a one-time engineering decision, but an institutional decision to deceive, maintained over years and across multiple levels of the organization. The management culture that produced the defeat device was not incidental to the fraud. It was the precondition for it. A company where engineers could report technical limitations honestly to management without career consequences, a company with a genuine culture of safety and quality over target performance, would have solved the clean diesel problem differently. It would have adopted urea injection systems like its competitors. It would have told the American market that its diesel technology had limitations that the regulations required it to address with additional cost. It might have sold fewer vehicles in the short term. It would not have written a defeat device. Ferdinand Piech's management philosophy, the culture of fear, the intolerance of failure, the expectation that engineers found solutions regardless of the technical constraints, did not directly order the defeat device, but it created the organizational environment in which the defeat device was the rational response to an impossible situation. The responsibility for that culture sits with the leadership that created and maintained it. The regulatory failure is also real. European and American emissions testing frameworks were, in 2008, not designed to detect defeat devices because no one had seriously considered that a major manufacturer would build one. The gap between laboratory testing and real-world performance had been known for years. Academic researchers had documented it, but the regulatory response had been slow. Volkswagen exploited a system that assumed good faith. The post-Dieselgate regulatory changes, real-world emissions testing, onboard diagnostic requirements, more sophisticated type approval processes, are meaningful improvements that will affect all manufacturers. They were produced partly by the VW scandal. The framework is better now because VW cheated, which is a peculiar form of contribution to progress. Here's what the Volkswagen story ultimately illustrates about how corporate fraud happens at scale. It doesn't typically happen because evil people make evil decisions. It happens because organizations under pressure, governed by cultures that punish failure, with targets that cannot be achieved through legitimate means, produce decision-making environments where fraud becomes the path of least resistance. The people who wrote the defeat device software were not sociopaths. They were engineers in a system that had told them, in every way except explicitly, that the alternative to a solution was unacceptable. The executives who received the certification documents and didn't ask the right questions were not cartoon villains. They were managers whose careers had been built in a culture where asking the wrong question, showing insufficient confidence, surfacing the wrong kind of problem could end advancement. The fraud happened in the space between the target and the truth, in an organization that had decided the target was more important than the truth.